I decided to start this website, Mind Health 360, to have as much information there as I could as a sort of free resource for people who could understand more about what might be contributing to their mental health symptoms. And, things that we don't usually think about: hormone imbalances, nutritional imbalances, toxins, heavy metals, inflammation, infections. You can have Lyme disease or Epstein-Barr, and that can cause inflammation, which can impact your mental health. And so it's really a tool to raise awareness and then also provide resources to people for free so that, they can find the help that they need.
Welcome to the Mind Health 360 show. I'm Kirkland Newman, and if you, your loved ones, or clients suffer from mental health issues such as depression, anxiety, insomnia, poor memory, poor attention, mood swings, exhaustion, etc., I interview the leading integrative mental health practitioners from around the world to help you understand the root causes of these symptoms, many of which may surprise you, and suggest solutions to help you heal. If you like this interview, please do subscribe and forward to others who might find it helpful. If you want further information, please go to www.mindhealth360.com or find us on social media.
Kiki, thank you so much for talking to me today. This is really exciting and I've wanted to do this for so long. And Mind Health 360 is amazing and I'm so excited to ask you all these questions. And I wanted to begin by asking you about your story and how Mind Health 360 began.
So first of all, thanks for doing this as well, Cressida. I think you're amazing and your podcast is amazing and I'm very impressed with it. And I love so many of your interviews about fear, which I think are brilliant. And it's a topic very close to my heart. I think I'm one of the most terrified people I know of. And it's a constant struggle to basically deal with my own anxieties and my own fears. But anyway, that's an aside. So my story, Mind Health 360, started because I had postpartum depression after both my boys. And the first one, I was offered a whole number of medications, so antidepressants, tranquilizers, and I didn't take any. And I sort of healed myself through meditation and good nutrition. And it was, I would have quite a few panic attacks with the first one. I was diagnosed with generalized anxiety and panic disorder. And one of the interesting things is I had no idea that postpartum depression could include that subset of panic attacks and anxiety. I just thought depression, it's when you're crying all the time or you're unhappy. And so it took me several months of having these panic attacks to actually see a psychiatrist and say, there's something not right here. And he said, oh, well, you have postpartum depression. And I thought, that, to me, it was quite incongruous that could actually take the form of panic attacks and anxiety. So that was a revelation, and I sort of healed myself on my own, essentially. And then the second episode after the second child was, 3.5 years later, was actually a lot worse. And there I did have depression, and I also had anxiety, and I had terrible insomnia, which I hadn't had the first time. So my insomnia was just crippling. I mean, I would sleep 2 or 3 hours a night, and it was just, it was just a terrible experience. And for 6 months this went on and my panic attacks got worse and I was crying all the time and it was just very debilitating. And for that, I was medicated. I was put on mirtazapine and Zopiclone, which is a sleeping pill. And I had not a very good reaction in the sense that it actually seemed to exacerbate my depression. So it helped with the panic and the anxiety and it helped with the sleep. But the depression got worse and I just got more and more sort of down, which the hallmark of my symptoms was more the anxiety than the depression. And the antidepressant ironically made the depression worse, it seemed. Wasn't happy with being on it. And I wanted to get off the sleeping pills because I was so dependent on them. And my psychiatrist said, oh, you'll be on these indefinitely. And I said, well, that doesn't make sense. I've never been on an antidepressant or a sleeping pill before. Why would I be on these indefinitely? Surely this is just temporary. And so I ended up weaning myself off the sleeping pills. And that took at least 10 days to get them out of my system. It was pretty bad. And then weaning myself off the antidepressants after 6 months was really tough. because I would have rebound panic attacks, rebound insomnia, and I had no help from my psychiatrist. She would say, well, you should still be on these. And then I got it down to such a small amount. It was 2 milliliters. And she was saying, oh, well, it's a placebo effect. It can't be having any physiological effect on you at that level. And yet I just felt that wasn't the case. And I did some internet research and I found all these other people in these forums who also had the same problem. They were on 2 milliliters and couldn't get off, and they've now, since then, there's research that's come out that's shown that actually the last 1% or something is the hardest to get off physiologically, not just psychologically. So I had a really bad experience on these drugs. And as a result, somebody actually gave me Susan Summers' book, which I think was called Breakthroughs at the time. This was back in 2011. And I found out about hormones through her. And so I went on this quest that then lasted 3 years. And I went to see Thierry Hertog, who's a gynecologist or a GP in Belgium. And he wanted to put me on all these replacement hormones. And then I came back and I went to the Marion Gluck Clinic and I saw an endocrinologist there and was put on bioidentical hormones, which were very helpful. I saw a nutritionist who then diagnosed me with adrenal fatigue and heavy metal poisoning and gluten intolerance, and I had all these sort of physiological biochemical things that were not right, which had never been tested by conventional psychiatry. And another thing is I'd breastfed for a year and I was low on omega-3s, low on vitamin Bs, low on Ds, and this all came up in the nutritional panels that they did on me. And through this whole experience and through the difficulty also that I had getting off my drugs, it took me, I would say, about 2 years after getting off my drugs to actually stabilize my system. It was almost as if these drugs had been stabilizing my system artificially and I had lost the ability to self-regulate. So whether it was positive stress, as in excitement and overstimulation, or whether it was negative stress, as in, anxiety, any sort of stimulation to my nervous system would just send me through the roof. And I didn't have that sort of variability. I'd lost the ability to self-regulate. And so through that experience, which was really difficult, and also the experience of finding all these other physiological biochemical things that were not right with me, and I discovered this thing called integrative medicine and functional medicine through this wonderful gynecologist in San Francisco called Dr. Sarah Gottfried. And she had written a book on how to reset your hormones. And she was doing webinars on adrenals and blood sugar and all these issues that were fascinating. And I thought, why did more people not know about this? And why have I seen 5 doctors, 2 GPs, 2 psychiatrists, an OBGYN, in fact, probably more than 5, an endocrinologist, and no one's ever mentioned my hormones. No one's ever, said, let's do some tests on your hormones, or let's look at your nutritional panels or status. And I thought there's such disconnect between the way I was treated, i.e. put on antidepressants and prescribed some CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, versus what was really going on with my physiology, which was all these sort of hormonal and nutritional imbalances. Plus, my adrenals were completely shot. I mean, for me, motherhood was a really intense time of transition, and it was very difficult because your whole life changes. And so there was a lot of stress, and I was a perfectionist. I wanted to be the perfect parent. I didn't want to make the same mistakes that my mother had made. And so there was a lot of anxiety, chronic stress, which then sort of depleted, my hormones and my adrenals. And I was, in this state of sort of burnout, essentially. And I now understand more about the nervous system, and I understand that I was in a state of sympathetic arousal for a very sustained period of time. And that just created a biochemical cascade in my body, which led to inflammation and led to all sorts of sort of weird physical symptoms. And so seeing the disconnect between how my mental health had been treated by mainstream medicine versus how I felt that it should be, and all the alternatives out there by very reputable, proper doctors who were just happened to be practicing functional medicine or integrative medicine, I thought, why do more people not know about this? And people need to know about this because this is really important. And just to give you another example, I had heart palpitations. So I went to see a cardiologist, and and he put a halter around me and said, yes, after 24 hours of monitoring, he said, yeah, you're having a lot of, ectopic beats and heart palpitations, but we don't really know what causes them. They're benign, but we can give you a beta blocker. This was 9 months postpartum. Why did he not say, go have your thyroid checked? Because we now know that, postpartum thyroiditis is very common and can cause heart palpitations, or, low estrogen. There are many hormonal reasons why you could be having heart palpitations. But in his mind, he's a very reputable cardiologist. It was, no, we don't know what's causing this. Take some beta blockers if you want. So as a result of that, I thought, okay, I need to raise awareness about this to help other people so that they don't have to go through the same experience. And I decided to start this website, Mind Health 360, to have as much information there as I could as a sort of free resource for people who could understand more about what might be contributing to their mental health symptoms. And things that we don't usually think about: hormone imbalances, nutritional imbalances, toxins, heavy metals, inflammation, infections. You can have Lyme disease or Epstein-Barr, and that can cause inflammation, which can impact your mental health. And so it's really a tool to raise awareness and then also provide resources to people for free so that, they can find the help that they need. And there's a database, a global database of people, doctors who practice integrative medicine that people can go to get help, because I'm just such a passionate believer that this is a more sustainable solution to people with mental health problems, and it gets to the root cause of what's really contributing to their mental health issues. Because the current model, NICE guidelines, which are the sort of clinical guidelines given by the government, are for mental health mainly SSRIs, so antidepressants, and CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. That's just the tip of the iceberg, and that's mainly treating the symptoms, especially the antidepressants, rather than the causes. So I'm very passionate about a different approach to treating mental health. And, I really want to create a revolution in the way mental health is diagnosed and treated, both in the UK, in the US, and around the world, really. So it's quite ambitious.
I think Mental Health 360 is such a clever name because you're really dealing with the whole thing, rather than when you go to a doctor and, as you were saying, they say, talk about your symptoms and give you a sleeping pill or a tranquilizer or whatever, and they don't talk about what are the causes. So then it gets very confusing. And then if you go to a nutritionist, they talk about something completely different to what a doctor or a psychiatrist talks about. So I think what you're doing is so interesting, and I really hope that more people hear about it. And just talking about hormones specifically, so in my mind, I think of like cortisol and insulin being the really powerful hormones in our bodies. Obviously, there's a lot more, but can you talk a little bit more about those hormones and why there is such an imbalance sometimes?
So there are quite a few key hormones that really impact your mental health. And this is something, I had no idea about. But so, for instance, you have your sex hormones, which are the main ones are testosterone, progesterone, and estrogen. And all of us, men and women, have these in varying degrees. Obviously, women have more progesterone and estrogen and less testosterone, and men have more testosterone. But these hormones and the hormonal balance are essential to your mental health because they dictate the status of your neurotransmitters. So, for instance, there's a correlation between estrogen and serotonin. Serotonin is your happy neurotransmitter that regulates your sort of sense of well-being and your moods and your sleep and your appetite. Progesterone is very linked to your GABA, so GABA being your calming neurotransmitter. So if you've got low estrogen, you're going to have low serotonin. Low progesterone, you're going to have low GABA. And consequently, you're going to feel pretty depressed, or you could feel pretty depressed if you have low estrogen, and pretty anxious if you have low progesterone. So those are just two sort of very basic examples. Testosterone dictates your libido and is also linked to your your dopamine. And so your sense of motivation and pleasure and drive, which come from your dopamine, are very correlated to your testosterone levels. Cortisol is a really important one. Cortisol and DHEA, are your sort of steroid hormones, and your adrenaline, which are very linked to your stress. So your levels of stress, when you feel stressed, you have a release of cortisol and adrenaline, which then have this very specific physiological impact. So they speed up your heart rate, they slow your digestion, they take all the blood and away from your digestion and put it in your limbs. So, there are a lot of physiological things that happen when you have high cortisol. We're designed to have high cortisol and high adrenaline in a very temporary way. So, it's like, I don't know, you're attacked by somebody and you have to be able to run or to flee, flee or to fight. And then consequently, there's this physiological response that pumps the blood to your limbs and makes your heart go faster and, shuts down the less necessary sort of metabolic processes like digestion. But the problem in our current societies is that this sort of high cortisol and high adrenaline is very chronic. And whether it's rushing to get your kids to school or financial worries or stressful relationships or sort of the 24/7 connectivity that we have with our devices and this constant feeling of pressure that we have to always be doing or be, being on. These are all ways that your cortisol ends up being sort of chronically elevated. And that has a physiological impact because one of the metabolic processes that slows down when you have high cortisol is your immune system. And so cortisol in the short term is necessary because it creates inflammation, and it boosts your immune system so that you can deal with whatever wound you have. But if it's chronic, what happens is that, you have this sort of chronic high inflammation. And we know that high inflammation is correlated with plenty of diseases, whether it's cancer, diabetes, autoimmune issues, but also mental health issues such as depression, cognitive decline, anxiety. And so, these hormones, whether they're our steroid hormones, our stress hormones, or our sex hormones, are absolutely crucial to our mental health. And I think the third one you mentioned, which is really important, is insulin, which regulates your blood sugar. And so when you eat sugar, for instance, or refined carbohydrates, you have a spike of insulin, which then accompanies this glucose, the sugars, into your cells. And what happens is if you have too much sugar constantly or too many refined carbohydrates, your cells become resistant to the insulin. And so they don't open the doors to the insulin anymore. And so you essentially have a lot of glucose going around your system and not getting into your cells. And this creates, can be something that leads to diabetes, for instance, and leads also to inflammation. And there's also a link between insulin and estrogen. So, also getting glucose into your brain cells. So, for instance, if you're insulin resistant, then you're going to possibly have more brain fog because you're not getting the energy that you need into your brain cells. So we don't think of this, but actually our hormones are so important to regulating, how we feel, how we're thinking. Are we sharp? Are we motivated? Are we happy? Are we calm? So much of these are sort of interactions between your hormones, your neurotransmitters, and all your bodily functions, which are really dictated by these hormones.
Yeah. So I'm wondering how you balance the hormones. Because I definitely feel that sometimes where I just feel there's a lot of cortisol running through my body that shouldn't really be that heightened, just like missing a train or forgetting something, and then feels all over the place. How do you balance them? I mean, I'd love to talk about nutrition a bit later, other than nutrition, like how can we just have a regular kind of hormone balanced system?
Totally. And I mean, that's, sort of the holy grail, isn't it? Like to balance our hormones, because that if your hormones are balanced, your neurotransmitters will be more balanced, your system will be more balanced. And I think one of the key things that springs to mind is stress. And so we live in such stress heightened societies, and, we have to try and manage our stress response. And so, as I said, having some sympathetic arousal, some cortisol is good and is healthy. You don't want to sit on a sofa all day and have no cortisol at all, because that's, it's not going to be very adaptive, essentially. But our modern societies, we're under constant stress. And so I think anything that you can do to lower your stress levels, whether it's meditation, yoga, walking in the woods, spending time with friends, laughing, just switching off, getting rid of the phone. Our phones we're constantly sort of bombarded by, whether it's dopamine hits or cortisol hits. We get a text and we don't know what that's going to be. What is it going to be? Bad news? Is it going to be something we have to do? Is it going to be something we've forgotten? Is it going to be something, negative or positive? But we just never know what's coming through that phone, but we're always open to receiving all these sort of pieces of information that are impacting our system and that can then create a stress response. So I would say, to balance our hormones, the most crucial thing is stress, to try and manage our stress as best we can. The second thing is definitely diet, as you said, and I know you want to talk about that later, but, eating less refined carbohydrates, so less processed foods, fewer sugars, no white bread. Well, as little as possible, sort of white breads, pizzas, candies, chocolate, etc. Because these all create insulin spikes, and they all can lead to insulin resistance, and they also can lead to inflammation. So sugar is very inflammatory. And also the blood sugar. Blood sugar is hugely important in mental health. And so what we want is to have sort of regular blood sugar control, which means fewer spikes of refined carbohydrates and more predictable sort of meals, where we have sort of 3 meals a day with proteins, fats, and sort of complex carbohydrates, rather than snacking on sugary food. So that's a really good way to manage your blood sugar, which in turn will decrease, your inflammation and also ensure more insulin sort of stability. So that's another way. What else? Other things that can disrupt your hormones are things like toxins. And, if you're exposed to mold, for instance, or you have heavy metals, that can cause inflammation in your pituitary, or any of your hormonal glands can be exposed to inflammation from these toxins. And that can then disrupt your hormones. And one more thing in terms of nutrition is, fats. So one of the key precursors to your hormones is cholesterol, believe it or not. And so, people bang on about how bad cholesterol is. And so a lot of people are on statins to lower their cholesterol, but actually cholesterol is hugely important as the building block of your hormones. And it's a precursor to pregnenolone, which is your master hormone. And from pregnenolone are made all your other hormones. And so, if you're getting the right fats, saturated fats, but also EFAs, essential fatty acids, such as omega-3s, these are all really important to regulate your hormones as well. Another hormone that I haven't mentioned is oxytocin, and that's a really important hormone. And it's the love and bonding hormone that comes through orgasm, childbirth, breastfeeding, but also just bonding, hugging, spending time with loved ones. You release oxytocin, which is an incredibly healing hormone, and which is also an antidote to the cortisol. And so, if you have a lot of oxytocin, then that will lower your cortisol, and vice versa. If you have high cortisol, it will lower your oxytocin. But oxytocin is such an important hormone for your feelings of well-being and happiness. And being inversely correlated with cortisol, it's a very good stress reducer. So social engagement, if you're talking about, the polyvagal theory, for instance, of Stephen Porges, it's all about, the connection between social engagement and the hormone oxytocin and the lowering of your cortisol. So I think, good relationships, spending time in, and that can be pets as well. Relationships with pets releases oxytocin. So not processed food, whole foods, balancing your blood sugars, reducing your stress, spending time with loved ones, and reducing your sort of toxin levels is very important.
And when someone says a toxic load, what does that mean?
That's another good question. So toxic load, again, it's something we don't think about when we think about mental health or hormones or anything, but essentially our environments are so replete now with toxins. So our air is much more polluted than it used to be. Our water is very polluted. Our foods are polluted with pesticides and herbicides. Our water tap water can have residues of chlorine, pesticides, herbicides, heavy metals, leads, coppers, etc. And the air that we breathe, if we live on a busy street, we're getting car exhaust or we're getting sort of factory exhaust. And the other problem with toxins is things that you don't necessarily think about, cleaning products for your home and your personal care products. So shampoos, toothpaste, skin creams. And the problem is all these, if you look at the number of toxins and chemicals over the past, I think 50 years has increased exponentially. I mean, the number of toxins runs in the, millions now. And our bodies are exposed to this in a way that it's not like we're exposed to one toxin. We're sort of in this toxic soup. And no studies have done studies, one, on the long-term effects of being in this toxic soup. So they might have studied a toxin for like 6 weeks or something, but it's never going to be over the years, and not in conjunction with each other. So we don't know how these toxins are interacting in our bodies. And again, no studies have been done on the interaction, the cumulative effect of all these toxins that can get stored in our fat cells, for instance. Our fat stores these toxins. Our bones can store lead, and what happens is our bodies accumulate these toxins, and then they can disrupt our microbiome. So they can disrupt our gut, they can cause inflammation, and they can then in turn disrupt our hormones. And there are a lot of, we now know, for instance, that Parkinson's is very linked to heavy metal load, and that Alzheimer's, neurodegenerative diseases. And
heavy metals, where does that come from? How do we absorb that?
That's another great question. So basically heavy metals, you think of lead, mercury, arsenic, cadmium, gallium. I mean, there are a whole bunch of them. And the main ways is from sort of factory exhaust, but also, if we eat tuna or swordfish, there's a lot of mercury in the sort of larger fish, and so we're better off eating smaller fish. Heavy metals are in the earth, they come from sort of, and I'm not exactly sure, but I do know that, for instance, a lot of chemical products that are used, whether it's in paints, I mean, they used to put lead in paints, now they don't anymore, but thermometers used to have mercury in them, and this stuff leaches into the ground, and it leaches into our food processes, and it leaches into our air. It can be in the water. Arsenic, for instance, which is quite a common one, ironically, is in rice. And so so if you're eating even brown rice, and brown rice tends to concentrate it even more. And so if you eat a lot of rice, and I'm not sure if the studies...
I eat a lot of rice.
Well, you have to be a little careful about that.
And I didn't know that.
Yeah, there's a lot of arsenic in rice. And I'm not sure about the organic rice. So if you eat organic rice, does that mean that there's less arsenic? But for instance, I've had to stop my kids eating as much rice as they were doing because their arsenic levels were through the roof, both of them. And one of them is gluten-free, so he eats a lot of replacement gluten products which are based on rice, and so he's been getting very high arsenic, I think, due to the rice. So that the heavy metals they're sort of ubiquitous, and if you have an MRI scan, you can get gallium in your system, and to get rid of them is not easy. I mean, smokers tend to have heavy metals as well. I think it's lead and
but
cadmium.
What sometimes I find tricky is, say, you can't always buy organic food and you can't avoid fumes all the time. And if you live in the city, you don't live in the country, and you don't have that choice to live the most healthy life that you want to live in terms of food, etc. What can you do? What are the tiny things that you can do?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it is a bit dispiriting, and you don't want to end up being, I mean, I tend to be quite neurotic. It's sort of like, oh, you can't drink that and you can't eat that and you have to be super careful and you have to live in a bubble. I mean, that's not the answer, but there are a few things that you can do. So, for instance, avoid large fish, so tuna, swordfish, shark, and focus more on anchovies, sardines, mackerel, smaller fish. Make sure that you eat as much as possible organic, because, the pesticide and herbicide residue and heavy metal residue is going to be much lower. Make sure that your drinking water is from a good source. Now, the problem with drinking water is that the tap's not great because there are a lot of contaminants. But bottled water isn't great either, because the plastics from the bottles can leach into the water, and leaching in BPA or other plastics. And that's not good either. And that plastics are known endocrine disruptors, which means that they actually disrupt your hormones. And they think that kids now who are having puberty earlier and earlier, a lot of it is due to the plastic. So never ever microwave or heat anything in a plastic container. So only cook with stainless steel or glass. Never cook in plastics. Never leave a bottle of water in the car that you then drink. I have a water filter, which is a reverse osmosis water filter, so it takes everything out of the water. The problem is it also takes the minerals out, so then you have to add the minerals back in because minerals are important. So that's one thing that you can do, is eat organic, make sure that your water is filtered. As much as possible, get out into nature. And, ideally, if you have a choice as to where to live, try not to live next to a very busy road, or make sure that your care products are organic as well and are very, you can read the ingredients and don't have parabens and phthalates and perfumes, and as natural and as organic as possible. Same with your household cleaners. I mean, use vinegar and bicarbonate of soda, or there are a lot of very good natural household products, but you always have to read the ingredients, because a lot of the advertising will say, oh, this is natural, but actually, if you actually read the ingredients, there's still a lot of stuff in there. So one is avoiding the toxins, but then two is enabling your own body to detoxify, because we're designed to detox things like these. The problem is when our system gets overloaded, or if we're stressed, or if we're not sleeping enough, then or if we have genetic pathways that mean that our detoxification systems aren't as good, or if our diet is poor and we don't have the right nutrients to detoxify, our own detoxification systems will be sluggish. And therefore, you need to really make those as functional as possible. And, one of the things I do is I have an infrared sauna, and I swear by it. I mean, the more I do it, the better I feel. And the sweat that comes out, sweating is a great way of detoxifying. And, an infrared sauna really gets deep into your tissues, into your cells, more so, I think, than a traditional sauna. Exercise is a great way to detoxify. Breathing. I mean, breathing is incredibly important in terms of detoxifying, and it sort of alkalizes your body when you breathe correctly. Otherwise, you could be in a state of acidosis. So, for instance, if you're surrounded by toxins and stress and you're not breathing properly, your system will become quite acid, and you want to bring it back into alkalinity by reducing your stress, limiting your toxin exposure, and breathing, sort of deep breathing out more than you breathe in. Also, eating the right food, so cruciferous vegetables, broccolis, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, those are because they're sulfuric, they basically are very good for your detoxification pathways. Same with garlic, onion, anything, those types of sulfuric compounds are very good to support your detoxification systems. You can supplement, you can take glutathione, which is a fantastic antioxidant, for your, essentially for your detox systems. And you can take milk thistle to support your liver to detoxify better. So there are a lot of supplements you can take. So I think it's a two-pronged approach. One, you avoid the toxins as much as possible. And two, you optimize your body's ability to detoxify.
Because the gut and the brain are so linked, aren't they? I think more than we ever will realize, or I think we're gradually beginning to realize, but I think they're so entwined.
And that's a really good point that I forgot to mention, which is fiber. And so one of the key detox pathways is through your colon and through your sort of digestion. And it's really important to eat the right fiber so that you are, binding and pushing out all the toxins, and that you have, that you're not constipated, and that you have regular bowel movements is super important for detoxification. And you're right, the gut and the brain are super connected, and more we're finding that, sort of things like leaky gut. And so leaky gut is gut permeability, is where the tight junctions in the, the lining of your gut wall is only one cell thick. And if that becomes compromised and becomes permeable, then what happens is that the undigested molecules in your gut can go out through these sort of leaky tight junctions into your system and cause systemic inflammation, because your body then doesn't recognize these molecules and thinks that, okay, this is some sort of attack, we have to mount an immune response, creates inflammation. And that can also get into your brain if your blood-brain barrier is slightly leaky. And if your gut lining is leaky due to stress or due to poor diet or due to, there are a number of things that can cause leakiness in your gut, then what might also happen is your blood-brain barrier becomes more leaky. And then you have this sort of systemic inflammation. And more importantly, you have neuroinflammation. And there's one compound called LPS, lipopolysaccharides, I think they're called, which are a component of gut bacteria, which when they get out of your gut and go into your system are notorious for causing inflammation. And so one, you want to make sure that your gut lining has as much integrity as possible and is built through, the right foods, proteins. You want to make sure that you're avoiding any inflammatory compounds. So if, say you have a gluten intolerance or you have an intolerance to dairy that's not been diagnosed and you keep eating gluten and dairy, that will cause inflammation. Eventually, it'll cause this leakiness in your gut lining, which will then cause neuroinflammation. So you want to diagnose any food intolerances. The other thing is gut dysbiosis. So the bacteria in your gut are incredibly important, and they've shown that, most of the communication between your gut and your brain is afferent, which means it goes from your gut to your brain rather than from your brain to your gut. And so the bacteria that are in your gut are absolutely crucial for your moods and your state of mind. And, 95% of your serotonin is actually made in your gut. And same with a lot of your other neurotransmitters, they're made in your gut. And you need the right bacterial environment for the right neurotransmitters to be made. And so you need to eat the right foods. You need to eat a lot of sort of green leafy vegetables, a lot of fiber, a lot of prebiotic foods such as artichokes and chicory and capers and onions, and also a lot of probiotic foods such as kimchi and sauerkraut and fermented foods, so that the bacteria in your gut are healthy, so that the good bacteria outweigh the bad bacteria. Because essentially your gut lining is, your gut is the longest barrier you have basically between you and the outside world. So everything that comes in that you ingest is then, goes into this gut. And if your gut is not healthy, it's really going to affect the rest of your system and your brain. And, one of the fascinating things is that they are now discovering that there's a particular bacteria in your gut that's been shown to be present 10 years before somebody develops Parkinson's. And so there's this link between this particular bacteria and developing Parkinson's.
Really?
And we don't understand yet, the mechanisms. And part of the problem is a lot of the studies have been done on animals as opposed to humans. But we do know that the quality of your microbiome, so what, the sort of makeup of your gut bacteria, is absolutely essential to your mental health. And equally, the integrity of your gut lining is absolutely essential to lowering inflammation, keeping your inflammation under check. And there's a huge resurgence of autoimmune conditions, currently in the world, and which we think, are in large part due to our diets of processed foods and chronic stress, which essentially will create this leakiness in the gut, will create gut dysbiosis, and then will lead to inflammation. And this chronic inflammation, which is a sort of chronic activation of your immune system, then the immune system starts to attack itself and create all these autoimmune conditions such as psoriasis and Crohn's disease and Hashimoto's and rheumatoid arthritis. And, there are hundreds of them. So, the gut is absolutely essential to mental health. And coming back to mental health, we know that certain gut bacteria, such as lactobacillus and certain bifidobacterium infantis, for instance, have been shown, and lactobacillus romanus, specifically to help with anxiety, for instance. And another fascinating study is they took these mice and they replaced the mice gut, they exchanged the gut microbiome of these mice, and their personalities changed as well. So the mice who had a certain microbiome were quite anxious, and then the anxiety moved to the other mice based on this transfer of gut. And now they have this thing called fecal transplant, which is where they actually transplant fecal matter from one person to the other to see how that impacts mental health. And it sounds revolting, but it actually has had fantastic outcomes in terms of helping people with depression and anxiety and autism and cognitive decline. So
I have so many questions. I have so many questions from that. In my head, I was going, don't forget that. I need to ask that. So just talking about good bacteria and bad bacteria, and this is a really simple question, but something like, just taking a probiotic every day, is that good to do that?
It's a good question. I mean, I would say yes. I'm not a nutritionist or a doctor, but I personally take probiotics. I think, why not? There's no downside. I think the most important thing is to clean up your diet. So to eat whole foods, unprocessed foods, organic foods.
And some people say don't eat red meat. Other people say you have to eat red meat for protein. So what is that?
It's a really good question. I mean, I personally, I'm not a vegetarian. I'm very sympathetic to vegetarianism. I personally think that for mental health, eating animal protein is good, because I do think that we get the most complete number of amino acids, which are the building blocks of proteins, in animal protein. And it's much harder to get that complete protein profile from vegan or even vegetarian diets. I also think that the B12 and the iron that you get from red meats is really important for your mental health and your hormone balance and your energy levels. Protein also, collagen, so proteins, which break down into these amino acids, are the building blocks of your neurotransmitters. So for instance, serotonin, you need tryptophan, which is an amino acid from protein, to make the serotonin. You need tyrosine and D-phenylalanine to make dopamine. And so it's absolutely essential that you're getting these amino acids. And if you are vegan, take a protein powder by all means. And there's a real correlation between girls who are vegan or, even boys, and for moral reasons, but then they a lot of them develop eating disorders, or can, because they have very low serotonin, or their low serotonin from the lack of protein is a contributing factor to their eating disorders. So it's difficult because proteins and amino acids are building blocks for that gut lining and help protect the integrity of the gut. And so it's a tricky one, because I personally think that eating meat is a good thing for your mental health. However, you don't have to eat that much of it. I mean, you can eat it in moderation. And I do think that 80% of your plate should be sort of vegetables, green leafy vegetables. And the other thing about green leafy vegetables is that, the fiber creates this compound called butyric acid, which is very important for sort of, it's as an anti-inflammatory in your gut. So, I think what you eat is absolutely essential to the integrity of your gut. Taking a probiotic I think, does no harm. It's always confusing, like which probiotic do you take?
So confusing.
Because there's so many out there.
And vitamins as well, because people say different things. You read stuff online that says one thing. You speak to a doctor, they say another thing. You speak to a nutritionist, they say another thing. It's really difficult to know what is the best thing to take for you, because obviously we're all so different. So it's so personal. How do you know that without having to do loads of very expensive tests? How do you know? Some people say, well, just take a multivitamin every day because then you get everything. But maybe that's not what you need. Maybe you need just one specific mineral or vitamin. So that's what I struggle with, is it's almost a bit too overwhelming.
It is really overwhelming, and I would agree with that. And that's why I think the basics are really important. Like eat a really good diet that's whole foods, not processed, mainly vegetables, lots of good fats, so olive oils, even some saturated fats such as coconut oil, but essential fatty acids, fish oil, oily fish, eggs. Those are all really good. They have phospholipids, which are essential for your cell membranes and for your brain, your brain cells. And the fats, the omega-3s are very anti-inflammatory, which is super important for your brain. And I think it is really overwhelming and confusing. It's interesting because recently I did a podcast with two ladies, Bonnie Kaplan and Julia Rutledge, and they were saying that a multivitamin, multi-mineral approach, what they call a multi-nutrient supplement, is much more effective than a single nutrient supplement. And so they were big advocates, and they've done a lot of research. They're both PhDs, to say that actually it's the combination. If you're going to take a supplement, take a combined supplement, which has all these different nutrients. So, I think there are 35 vitamins and minerals in this one supplement. Because, if you take too much of one thing or too much of something else, or, if it's in isolation, it doesn't always work. And some of the problem is that the research is limited in the sense that a lot of research that's usually done on supplements is done on a single nutrient. And so it shows, okay, well, there's some benefits to vitamin C or there's some benefits to vitamin D. And I think, this idea of taking a multi-nutrient is a very good one, but equally, there are things that you can't bottle. So for instance, phytochemicals, so the polyphenols, which are in blueberries or green tea or cacao. So they have these polyphenols, which are very anti-inflammatory, antioxidant compounds, herbs. You can't bottle those. I mean, they've tried, and you can to some extent, but, most of your vitamins and minerals don't have these in them, and they're not as deliverable. So there are certain things that you get from your foods that are really important just to get from the food.
And what do you think is the worst thing we could be eating right now? What is that?
Sugar. Absolutely.
The worst thing.
The worst thing. And, it kills me to say this because both my kids are addicted to sugar.
Me
and
too.
Eat sugar all the time.
I was about to ask you that, and I knew you were going to say that, but I just wanted to check that it is the worst thing, because I am completely addicted to sugar. Completely.
It's not great, Cressida.
No, I know.
It's not great. Because, I mean, the problem with sugar, and, my friend Robert Lustig, Professor Lustig, he's a big advocate of the sort of, sugar-free, and he's just written a book called Metabolical, which is all about processed foods, because it's not just, it's not just that refined white sugar that you see. It's also, pizza dough and like refined carbohydrates, white flour, then gets converted to sugar. So obviously it's slightly less bad than taking a spoonful of sugar, but things like, sodas or Coke or 7-Up or whatever it is, I mean, they have like I don't know, 34 grams of sugar in them, which is like 15 tablespoons or something. I can't remember the exact numbers, but it's a lot of, sugar. And sugar is incredibly inflammatory, and it's, not good for your gut. It's not good for your blood sugar control at all, because it spikes your blood sugar. It's not good for your insulin. And we know that a stable blood sugar is really important for mental health.
Yeah.
And we know that we want to reduce inflammation. And it's also empty calories. There's no nutritious value at all in sugar.
And do you think, I'm slightly going off here, but I do really want to ask you this, because a great fear of mine is losing my mind, like getting older and losing my memory, which so many of us do. My grandmother did, lots of people do. And I want to come to genetics in a minute, but is a lot of that, would you say, to do with things like sugar and what we eat and, Alzheimer's, dementia? Is that linked, or is that quite a out there thing to suggest?
No, it's super linked. And in fact, I just did a podcast with Dr. Kat Toops, who's just one of the world's experts on dementia. And, my mother has dementia, and it's absolutely a terrible, terrible disease, and it's an epidemic. It's going to increase. My feeling is, well, based on my research, and Dr. Dale Bredesen wrote The End of Alzheimer's, and which is brilliant, and Kat is coming out with Dementia Demystified, which is going to be her book on it. It's a combination of factors, and so high sugar, processed foods obviously are big factors in that, and they have, these neurodegenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's are very much linked to the health of your mitochondria. Your mitochondria being the cells in your body that are the sort of powerhouses, the batteries that power your cells. And they produce ATP, adenosine triphosphate, which is the energy chemical. And, sugar has an adverse reaction on your mitochondria. And, so sugar is key. Eating the right foods. I think in terms of dementia, stress is a big one. It's due to chronic inflammation. And so if you have chronic inflammation over time, it destroys your brain cells, your neurons. And that's what happens. I mean, these neurodegenerative diseases, your brain cells just don't regenerate, and they start to sort of atrophy. So you have brain atrophy. So stress, the way you eat. Genetic, obviously they've identified the APOE4 gene, which is a marker for Alzheimer's, but your genes are not your destiny. I mean, there's a lot you can do. Exercise is absolutely crucial for preventing dementia. And in fact, two of the most inexpensive and effective ways of avoiding dementia are meditation and exercise.
So meditation, which is something I do try and do, but it's a lot of times like, am I doing it right? How do I do it? People have different ways of doing it. People have mantras. People focus on their breath. What is the best way to meditate?
It's a really good question. I mean, I'm a long-term meditator. I think it's the only way I stay sane, which is always a daily struggle. But for me, meditation, the one somebody said once, and this was so useful to me, was you don't have to clear your mind. All you have to do is notice your thoughts. And so all you have to do is become the observer of your thoughts. And so rather than saying, okay, I've got to empty my mind, I've got to push all these thoughts away. And my Zen meditation teacher said this. He said, you should neither lasso nor whip away the bull being the thoughts. So you don't draw them towards you. So when you have a thought, which is this bull, you don't lasso the bull and pull him in. You let him go, and you don't whip him away. So you don't get upset and say, oh, I shouldn't be having that thought. You're simply the observer, and you just observe your thoughts and your feelings as they come and go, like clouds in the sky. So for me, mindfulness is one of the most powerful practices. It's just sitting on a pillow, being anchored to your breathing, and just using your breath as an anchor, and then just noticing thoughts, feelings, sensations, and letting them go. So not getting too attached to anything and not getting too attached to even emptying your mind, just saying, okay, this is what's happened, this is the present, and I'm just going to let all this go.
Mm-hmm.
And if you make that a daily practice, it can be hugely helpful. And I think it's one of the most amazing tools that we have at our disposal to manage our mental health and our physical health, frankly.
On my podcast, the two things that people say that really helps them in their life, and I always ask people what's the habit or routine that's kind of changed their life, and the two things that come up a lot is meditation and cold water therapy, which I haven't really got into, but I everyone says it's the best for your nervous system and your immune system. But meditation it almost feels like it's a kind of a discipline in a way until it seems until you really enjoy it, if that makes sense.
It's a real discipline. And I think, I interviewed this wonderful guy who's a suicide survivor, Kevin Hines, and he jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge and survived. And he's such an inspirational character. And he said, for me, it's not that my desire to kill myself is gone. I still have it every day, but it's a daily practice to manage it. And I think the daily practice approach to mental health is really important. And the daily practice of meditation is really important. And it's almost like exercise. Like, you don't really want to do it, and you don't want to sit there and you're like, I don't have time for this. But the more you do it, the more it becomes a discipline, and the more it becomes a practice and a habit. And actually, the easier it will become. And I think it's that daily practice that is so important. And back to your dementia question, there was one more thing I wanted to say. So exercise and meditation are key. But the three things that Kat Toops was saying were really often overlooked in dementia are hormonal imbalances. So as we were talking about before. And, because testosterone and estrogen are very linked to BDNF, which is brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which are trophic factors for our neurons, essentially, growth factors. And the things that actually increase our growth factors are, exercise, meditation can help with BDNF, but also having the right hormones. So if we have hormone deficiencies, it can impact our BDNF. The other thing, and obviously cortisol, high cortisol over a long period of time is very neurodegenerative. The other thing she mentioned was toxins. So we've spoken a bit about those and how heavy metals and plastics and these toxins can be very damaging to our neurons and create inflammation, which damages the neurons, especially in the hippocampus, which is where our memory centers are. And the third thing, which we haven't spoken about, are infections. So things like Lyme disease, Epstein-Barr, herpes, they found that 98% of autopsies that they did of patients with Alzheimer's had herpes. I can't remember if it was one or two.
And when you say herpes, do you mean the sexually transmitted disease, or do you mean herpes as in simplex virus, which is
the cold sores?
The cold sores. I have no idea where that came from or why I have it, but I have ulcers. I get ulcers a lot, and that is the virus that I've had for a long time, since I was a teenager.
And it's very common. I think something like 80 or 90% of us have herpes and have Epstein-Barr, for instance.
Yeah.
Now, the problem with these viruses is they're very opportunistic. So they'll stay in your body. And then if you have a period where you're under stress or your immune system is down, then they're opportunistic. So they'll basically flourish. And you'll have a reactivation of these viruses. And I think it was herpes simplex, so I think it was the cold sore variety, but I couldn't swear to it, that was so linked with Alzheimer's. But it's not just that, it's also Lyme disease and all the tick-borne diseases like Bartonella and Babesia and Borrelia. And, the EBV and the herpes and there's so many of these viruses, cytomegalovirus and Coxsackie virus.
Where do these come from? So for me, for example, herpes simplex virus, which I have, flares up when I'm tired, flares up when I eat sugar, which is a lot. Where do they come from?
I think, so the viruses are pretty much everywhere. I mean, it's like, the COVID virus now. I mean, they're everywhere. So they get transmitted in different ways. So EBV gets transmitted through saliva, for instance. Coxsackie virus is, probably airborne. So there are many different ways. Herpes, I think if it's probably, I'm not sure, either airborne or you get it through saliva exchange. I'm not sure. Obviously, the sexually transmitted one is through that sort of exchange. So they're always sort of there in our environment. And the question is the terrain favorable or not? And are you susceptible to that particular virus? And if you are susceptible and you get it, then it reactivates when you're under stress. And so they're really hard to get rid of, these things. And the problem is they can create, if they're in a sort of low-level activation, they can then create this low-level inflammation, which again contributes to neurodegeneration. It can contribute to depression, anxiety, a lot of mental health issues. And more we're discovering, in fact, there's this whole field called psychoneuroimmunology, which is essentially the effects of your immune system and inflammation on your mental health and your moods and your anxiety levels and your neurodegeneration. And it's tricky because a lot of us don't even know that we have these viruses. I mean, I was recently diagnosed with something like 5 or 6 viruses, and that sent me into a tailspin because I didn't know. But my Epstein-Barr, for instance, is active at the moment because I'm under a lot of stress. And so that's creating all these, a lot of my anxiety could be due to the EBV virus, which is reactivated. So there are ways of treating them. I mean, you can take certain supplements, you can take herbal protocols, but the most important thing is stress reduction. I mean, again, nervous system, and that's why I come back to, the work of Stephen Porges and Bessel van der Kolk and Benjamin Fry. I mean, all these guys who work with the nervous system, because the best way that you can help your body is to be in a parasympathetic state. Your parasympathetic nervous system, which is the part of your nervous system that's relaxed and that allows you to rest, digest, and repair, is absolutely essential for repair. So cellular repair is the key to health. And so we have to be in that state of calm relaxation in order to be repairing. And most of us, unfortunately, spend a disproportionate amount of our time in our sympathetic states of our nervous system, or in dorsal, which is sort of shut down. And I think that's why there's such an epidemic of chronic disease, whether it's diabetes or cancer, or autoimmune disease, or mental health. I mean, there's a huge epidemic in mental health. And I really believe that it's because our nervous systems are so overwrought that we don't give our bodies time to heal from these toxins and viruses, etc.
And a lot of that comes from trauma, doesn't it? And when I say trauma, that doesn't have to be you were in a horrible car crash. It can mean that. Trauma can mean different things for different people. Someone can be affected by a certain trauma and that wouldn't affect another person. It can mean lots of different things, big or small. But how does that affect our mental health throughout our lives if we have a trauma from a young age or whenever?
Such a good question. Last night, I actually went and watched Gabor Mate's movie, The Wisdom of Trauma.
Oh, wow.
Which was really good. And it was hard to watch, actually, because, there is so much trauma out there. And, we think, as you were saying, we think of trauma as like some terrible abuse or accident that might have happened, which we call trauma with a big T. But there's so many little t traumas, which are, neglect, or say your parents were too busy to look after you, or, the smaller types of trauma, a sense of abandonment or a sense of low self-worth, which then manifest as an inability to look after yourself because, you don't think you deserve to be looked after, or you don't deserve self-care. And I think, they've shown a correlation between adverse childhood experiences, and there are 10 of them that they identified in this longitudinal study, and including death, divorce, abuse, and I can't remember all of them, and people who had, I think it was 6 or more of these adverse childhood experiences, had much worse life outcomes than other people. And there's absolutely no doubt that early childhood trauma, or trauma or chronic stress that you've been living with, is going to impact your mental health in a huge way. And I think the biological mechanism of that is that, again, you're in a state of hyperarousal and hypervigilance and sympathetic nervous arousal. So if you're a kid, for instance, and you're being abused, or you're having a very difficult childhood with people fighting, and maybe your parents are fighting a lot, or your siblings, you're in a very sort of difficult environment, you're in a state of chronic stress, which hyperarousal, you're always on the lookout for the next thing that might go wrong. And that creates a state of chronic inflammation, which as we've seen, can dysregulate your hormones, your neurotransmitters. It can make your immune system much less resilient. And so I think, we know, for instance, that addiction and a lot of mental health issues are very linked to these early childhood traumas. And as you say, I mean, it could just be that your parents were too busy to really look after you, and then that you internalize that as a lack of self-love and a lack of self-worth. And then as an adult, you don't really know how to look after yourself. And so maybe you're always looking after other people, and you're putting yourself last. And Gabor Mate was saying, he wrote this wonderful book, When the Body Says No, because it's all about how we essentially don't look after ourselves enough, and then our body just rebels and gets sick and says, hey, I'm here, and often with tragic consequences. And so I think healing trauma, and the other thing, which is Benjamin Fry often talks about, is if you have this trauma in your nervous system, you will have what he calls a dysregulated nervous system, which then means that you either overreact or you underreact to certain circumstances and people in your life. And so, for instance, you could be at work and a colleague says something, and that would warrant a 3 out of 10 response. But because of your baggage, your trauma baggage, you'll have a 9 out of 10 response with and then there are all these consequences to that. And so it's really important to deal with your baggage and your trauma baggage so that you're aware of what your triggers might be, so that you are able to have more harmonious relationships, because otherwise it snowballs, and so your trauma creates more trauma essentially around you. And I'm a big believer in the fact that it's really important to do that work on yourself and on your nervous system, to be aware of what your triggers are, what your traumas are, what your patterns are, so that you can then heal them through some sort of somatic therapies and go into the nervous system and regulate it, so that you then have more appropriate, balanced responses to events and people. And, you become better colleagues, better parents, better friends, better lovers.
I definitely see myself doing that sometimes, and I see other people doing it as well. When you react to something that doesn't need that bigger reaction internally, something that maybe needs like a 2 reaction is like a 10 reaction, and then it just completely messes up your whole inner life for that moment. So I completely see that, relate to that.
Completely. And, and I think mental health concerns, I mean, I'm very interested in the biochemistry of mental health, so the chemical imbalances and the leaky gut and those things. But essentially, the more people I speak to now, whether they're doctors or therapists, the more I think a lot of it comes from dysregulated nervous systems and early childhood trauma, which then translate into biochemical imbalances. And an interesting thing, I was talking to Neil Nathan and Jill Christa about mold, for instance, and mold toxicity. So mold is a big problem when it comes to neurodegeneration and inflammation, neuroinflammation. You're actually more susceptible if you're in a moldy environment. So we know that about 75% of people can detoxify exposure to mold. They're not that affected by it. But then the remaining 25% are very affected by it. And why are they affected by it? Maybe it's a genetic SNP that means that they're less likely to detoxify, or they have less optimal detoxification pathways. However, we also think that if their system has been traumatized, or they've suffered from chronic stress, they're going to be less resilient to these biochemical stressors such as toxins and also infections. So we were talking about infections earlier. We'll be more susceptible to these infections if our nervous systems are dysregulated, if we've had trauma, if we've had chronic stress. And so it's a perfect storm, because essentially then, you have the psychospiritual factors such as trauma, difficult life circumstances, stressors, and then you're more susceptible to the biochemical load, the sort of biochemical stressors. So it's all about stress, but it depends, are these psychological stressors or are they biochemical stressors? And, you have to be so aware of both. And that's what I'm trying to do with the Mind Health 360, is to be able to treat these psychospiritual stressors, but equally the biochemical stressors, because I don't think that you can sustainably heal mental health without treating across the board, essentially.
And also, I think there's perhaps those traumas that happen at a young age that we're not so aware of because we don't remember. They're just in our bodies. In later life, that lack of self-esteem perhaps shows its ugly face, and then there's sort of a lack of meaning and purpose, potentially. And I wanted to ask you what I think meaning and purpose is so important for our mental health, and if you have a lack of that, how does that affect us?
It's a great question. I think. And interestingly, on my website, one of the most visited pages is lack of meaning and purpose, which really blew my mind, because I thought, it would never have occurred to me that was such a popular page. And I think, a sense of being needed and being, that your life actually has purpose is incredibly regulating to your nervous system. It's incredibly regulating to your sense of self-worth. But it's an issue, because some people can start off in early life, as you say, having these traumas that some of them are not even aware of. And then they live these incredibly purposeful lives. So they become doctors, they become social workers, they go off and they work in camps with refugees. But, are they doing this? What is driving them? And is it a sense of low self-esteem, low self-worth that makes them believe that their life has to have purpose? I don't know. I mean, I don't know the answer to that, but I think there's a lot of codependency in the caring professions, essentially, about, the feeling that your life has to have meaning and purpose. But at the same time, I do also think that having meaning and purpose is a gift. And I think, because existentially, you sort of think, okay, what's the point of this life? And my belief is we're here to learn and we're here to grow. But we do that a lot through interacting with others. And I also believe that we're here to help each other. And there's this beautiful quote by Ram Dass, which is, we're all just walking each other home. And I do believe that a sense of belonging and a sense of having this purpose in your life is a real gift. And conversely, the emptiness of feeling that you don't have a purpose, whether it's due to lack of self-worth, because spiritually you can say, well, we don't need a purpose. Like, we all just are beautiful and perfect the way we are, the way we exist. But our cultural upbringing and our, make us believe that our life has to have purpose. So it's a really fine balance between, that spiritual concept of we're perfect as we are and we don't need to do anything to deserve love. We can just be, and we're beautiful and perfect, versus, our life has to have purpose and meaning, and we have to help people, and we have to engage with people, and we have to engage with the world. And for me, that's always been a very interesting balance. And then also, how much do you lose yourself, or do you give yourself away when you're giving to others? How much do you exhaust yourself? I mean, Gabor Mate was talking about how people who get cancer are often people who are overgivers. They're always looking after other people's needs at their own expense. And so it's just this very tricky balance. But
interesting that I didn't know that. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's, it's quite scary, because as somebody myself who's quite codependent, who I always feel that I have to help everybody else, I think, oh shit, does that mean I'm going to get sick because I'm not looking after my own needs? And it is that balance of self-care and feeling that you deserve to look after yourself and you deserve to care for yourself. And also that you're worthy just because you are, not because you're doing something.
And I wonder how people that feel they don't have that, how they can find that, because you do hear a lot of people, I hear a lot of people say, more younger people, often people that are leaving university, they don't know what their purpose is yet, or they don't know the meaning of life. Well, none of us really know the meaning of life, but people are trying so desperately to find their purpose and get so frustrated and angry and depressed when they don't know what that is. So I wonder how people are supposed to find it when they feel they don't have that.
Yeah, and that's such an important question. And it's funny because my ex-husband was always saying, you're so lucky you have a sense of purpose, and I don't really know what that is, mine, And in some ways, life was a lot simpler before, because, it was just about survival. I mean, our purpose was less important in the sense that we knew that we had to provide for ourselves and our family, and we had to just survive. We had to put food on the table. And now, you've got Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's like our basic needs are taken care of. So now we climb up the ladder and we're sort of more into what are our spiritual needs. And I think our sense of meaning and purpose is more a spiritual need, essentially. And I do think it's really tough for young people, because in some ways, we've lost a sense of community. We've lost a lot of these kids are sort of, their survival is okay. They're taken care of. They're mollycoddled, and it's sort of like, okay, well, I'm going to university, and then what am I going to do? There's a sort of malaise, a general malaise as to, what is the meaning of my life and what am I meant to be doing and how do I find that? And in old times, it was like, oh, well, you go out and you farm the land, or you go to war, or, and we don't have that anymore as much in our societies. And I think my advice is, because I certainly had that. I mean, I had very much no idea what I wanted to do after college, and a real sense of malaise and emptiness that I didn't know what my life was for. And so what I did is I did a lot of things, so I worked for Rockefeller Brothers Fund, and I worked in advertising and for IBM, and I worked for the Princess Trust, and I did this big urban music festival. And each time they were experiences that were important and formative, but I didn't feel like this sense of purpose. And it was, and then I went off and I did a master's in Middle Eastern studies, and I was really involved in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And, and I was sort of like, is that my purpose? But that was more inherited from my mother, because my mother was a big Palestinian activist. And so, it was only through my own suffering and through my own mental breakdown that I found my meaning and purpose. And if I hadn't gone through that, I would never have been doing what I'm doing now. And I'm incredibly grateful now, because I'm so clear that this is my purpose and that this is what I'm meant to be doing. And that's a gift. But that only happened, when I was about 45, about 5 years ago. So it took me a long time to get to this point. And so my advice would be, just try as many different things as possible. See what, makes your heart sing. See what you find interesting. But the problem is, a lot of the time, you actually come to your sense of meaning and purpose through suffering, I think. And through adverse experiences, and through challenges in your life. And there's so many stories of people who've had these adverse experiences And that's completely changed their lives, and they've discovered their sense of purpose through these experiences. And I don't wish that on anyone. I mean, I hope that people can find a sense of purpose without that. And some people are quite clear. They're like, I want to be an artist, I want to paint. And they're very lucky to be very in touch with, you know, their own sort of creativity and their own flow. But a lot of us are conditioned to feel that we have to do a certain thing at university, and then we have to have a certain type of job, and we have to make money in a certain way or do a certain thing. And we've lost touch with what really is our sort of inner essence. So we've become disconnected from our true self. And sometimes that adverse experience can reconnect us to our true self and put us back on the path, away from the conditioning that we've had from our parents and our teachers and our societies, all about what we should be doing rather than, you know, what we really want to be doing. And I've always been very envious of people who have a huge clarity, and often people in the creative industries, you know, painters, artists, singers, you know, who are just very clear about the fact that this is their, you know, this is their dharma, essentially, their path. But I think that's rare. And so my advice is just try as many different things as possible. And unfortunately, I think at some point life will usually send you some sort of message or a hard knock, and then that will often change your course. But, you know, if it seems hard in the present, often you'll look back and say, actually, that was the pivotal point in my life where I discovered my purpose.
And it feels like a lot of it comes down to that feeling of self-worth as well, and trusting ourselves if we love doing something, to follow that path, or to just love ourselves. As cliche as that sounds, when people talk about loving yourself, it's kind of feels so almost overused now, but it is true, isn't it? It's so true. It's so important.
It's so important. And I think, you know, people who are less hard on themselves, and they you know, I mean, look, full disclosure, I mean, I always wanted to be a singer. I always wanted to be an opera singer, you know, from a very young age. And it was always my passion. And, you know, my mother said, oh, well, you're not fat enough to be an opera singer, you know. But the point is, I think in some sense, if I'd had more self-worth, I would have pursued that in a more dogged way, instead of saying, okay, no, well, I've got to go to Oxford and I've got to do well and I've got to then do the right thing. And you know, and obviously I think in some ways your path is sort of, in some sense, predetermined, or there's some sort of universal influence on it. Because if I look at my life, there have been certain milestones that have led me to where I am now, which are so clearly just placed there by some sort of divine power, I think. But so yeah, I mean, I think to your point, self-worth it's a wonderful thing. But you know, some of the biggest artists and are the most tortured as well.
Definitely.
Yeah.
I know a lot of them.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. I mean, some of the most amazing poets and writers and dancers and, you know, are very tortured souls, and probably are driven, you know, by lack of self-love.
And I think that's,
well.
I mean, this is totally going off track, but that's what can be so beautiful about an amazing painter or singer or, you know, actor, or someone that's just got that kind of raw talent, is because you see the pain in the art and you relate to it, because that is part of life, is to suffer. So I think we connect to that, but I suppose they make that because from their own, you know, sense of pain somewhere inside themselves. If that makes any sense.
It makes total sense. And it's funny, it reminds me of Rumi. He said the wound is where the light gets in. And I've always been struck by that, and I think you're absolutely right. Like, you know, we identify with the pain that we see in their work, because it's something that we can connect to, because we've experienced it ourselves. And I think that's what makes it come alive. Yeah.
So I've got my last question before my last question. A little going back a bit, but I wanted to ask you, I was wondering about nurture and nature, because we sort of touched on it a bit. But sometimes I think you think, oh, I was born with that, so I'll just always have that, can't get rid of that. Or was I born with that thing? Or was that from school? Or was that from my environment? You know, you don't really know. You can look at your parents and kind of see that. So maybe you think, oh, it's from them. Can you get rid of that? Can you, you know, and I'm talking kind of like on an emotional sense, and also a, you know, a physical thing as well. Like, for instance, like imbalance of hormones. How much of that is nature and how much of that is nurture?
Yeah, and that's the age-old question, isn't it? Nature versus nurture. And we used to think that most of it was nature. And, you know, my mother would always say, oh, that's just nature. You know, there's nothing you can do. You were born that way. That's it. But now they've actually shown, the field of epigenetics has shown that actually you have so much influence on whether your genes are switched on or off according to your environment. And so if you take it from a purely biochemical scientific perspective and you look at genetics and epigenetics, actually epigenetics are certainly just as, if not a lot more important than your genetic sort of
And epigenetic
baggage.
meaning your environment.
Exactly. So epigenetic are all the factors that impact your genes. So your nutrition, your exercise, your relationships, your stress levels, all the things that we've talked about. And so, you know, you have your genes, but whether they get turned on or off will depend on your environment and your environmental factors. And they've done lots of studies on identical twins, and they've found that's how they've studied this sort of epigenetic factor. And they've recently found that it's much more important than they ever thought in the past. So I would say certainly it's a balance, obviously, of your genetic makeup and your terrain, and essentially, you know, what you were. And it's not just genetics. I mean, you know, you have to start looking at sort of intergenerational stuff and karmic stuff and stuff that comes. So, for instance, you know, we know that your microbiome is partly influenced by your mother's it's very influenced by your mother's microbiome, which is influenced by her mother's microbiome. And so there's a sort of intergenerational baggage that gets passed on. And interestingly, you know, we now talk about the emotional, so the transgenerational trauma. And if there's been trauma in one generation, then it gets passed down. And we think it actually gets somehow embedded in our DNA, you know, and I don't know about the mechanisms, but that it's not just a sort of expression, intergenerational trauma, but there's actually a biochemical imprint of this trauma. And so, you know, we are, I think, the sum total of everything and everybody that's passed before us. And we have this baggage, but then we're so capable of changing it. I mean, I'm a big believer in yes, we have this terrain, but there's so many things that we can do to impact that, whether it's how we choose to sleep, how we choose to eat, the relationships that we choose. And I'm also a big believer in doing work on yourself. And I feel that we have responsibility as individuals in doing the work that we need to do to become better people and to grow and to learn from our mistakes and to evolve, essentially. And, you know, regardless of our genetic makeup, regardless of our early life experiences, I think if we get to the end of our lives and we've had a real learning curve and we've, you know, developed and we've made the right choices, or whatever right is, but we've made healthy choices that have enabled us to grow and enabled us to sort of spread health and harmony amongst our circles and ourselves, you know, then we've done a good job. We have a huge amount of influence over our lives and over what we choose and what we don't choose. And, you know, just as our genetics, our epigenetics are absolutely crucial in terms of the expression of our genes, what's also crucial is the choices that we make and, you know, who we become as people. And, you know, it's tricky because people with mental health issues, you know, you don't want people to feel unduly responsible or blamed or, you know, say, well, you know, if you're depressed, I mean, I'm very against that sort of, oh, well, just get over it or, you know, get out of bed or whatever. But I do think that with the right help and the right support, there's a lot that can change if we're getting the right biochemical treatment, the right psychospiritual treatment, and the right lifestyle advice. And I mean, there's this huge group of people now, sort of health coaches, that's been resurgent in functional medicine. And so there are all these health coaches who are there to basically help you on your path towards wellness and help you make the right decisions and help you choose the right lifestyle and psychospiritual and biochemical therapies that will help you become the best, healthiest person you can become, essentially. And I think that's the journey that we're all on, is to try and, at the end of our lives, be as healthy and as fulfilled and as, you know, and have learned as much as we can.
Kiki, thank you so much. I've learned so much. My brain is kind of exploding right now. I want to go home and empty my fridge and replace it with greens. At the moment, it's just full of crap, which is not good. Kiki, thank you so much. This honestly has been wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to the Mind Health 360 show. I hope that we've helped you realize that mental health symptoms have root causes that can and need to be addressed in order to sustainably heal, and have given you some ideas about steps you, your loved ones, or clients may take to start their healing journey. Please share this interview with anyone you think may find it helpful, and don't forget to subscribe to keep up to date with our latest interviews on integrative mental health. If you want further information, please go to www.mindhealth360.com or find us on social media. This information is for educational purposes only and is not intended to diagnose or treat any disease or to replace medical advice. Please always consult your healthcare practitioner before discontinuing any medication or implementing any changes in your diet, lifestyle, or supplement program.